Good morning, everyone. We're so happy you're here today. Welcome to our session, Building Inclusive Trails and Outdoor Spaces. This session is going to be 1 hour in length. We are in webinar mode, so you are not able to be heard or seen. We do encourage you to put your questions into the Q&A function, and we'll do our best towards the end of the session to address your questions. This session is being recorded and will be available to see at ihearttrails.org, as well as Rails to Trails Conservancy's YouTube channel. Please fill out the online session evaluation after the session closes, and a link to that survey will be provided in the chat. So without further ado, I am so grateful and really excited that we have Leon Bibb, Cleveland's own journalist, here today from WKYC-TV. He's going to be moderating and introducing our panel. So without further ado, I want to pass it to you, Leon. Thank you so much. Leon, I think you're muted. There you go.
Thank you, Liz. I appreciate the fine introduction, and it's a pleasure to be with you today. And I think we're going to have a spirited conversation for the next hour or so. Let me tell you a little bit about my childhood. I had what was called a wonderful childhood. I lived in the city and still live in the city of Cleveland, or I live in suburban Cleveland now. But I lived in a neighborhood called Glenville when I was a youngster growing up. Glenville runs from Lake Erie south to the Wade Park area and nestles itself up against a neighborhood called University Circle, where so many of our cultural institutions are located. There's a green space that goes from my house all the way to University Circle to the south and all the way north to Lake Erie. And on 5 days a week during the summer out of school months, my friends and I, mostly boys, we walked northward to Gordon Park, which hugged Lake Erie. We had a little league baseball team there, and we played baseball 5 days a week during the summer months when we were out. Either walked or we bicycled, or sometimes we just sprinted. My house was roughly about 150 yards from the Cultural Gardens of Cleveland, the world-renowned gardens, where there are 33 gardens, each one representing an ethnic group which has settled in Cleveland. And I would walk in those gardens, in those green spaces. My parents, my father, and my sister, my mother, and I, we would walk in those gardens. Sometimes a long time ago, we would even walk there as late as the midnight hour. It was a safe place to walk, and we enjoyed it, especially in those days before air conditioning in homes became as prevalent as it is right now. I could bicycle to those gardens. I probably could get there on my bicycle in about 15 seconds. I could jog there probably in about 30 seconds. I could walk there in about 1.5 minutes to 2 minutes and get to the edge of the Cultural Gardens. I was also a Boy Scout growing up in the Cleveland area, and we went to a place called the North Chagrin Reservation of what is now called the Cleveland Metro Parks. And we Boy Scouts would camp out with our Scoutmaster and our parents sometimes, who were part of the Boy Scout committee of my troop there in Cleveland. We would camp out there overnight for long periods of time. And we ate there, we slept there, we had conversations there, we studied the environment and all those kinds of things. And when I was in high school, I was on the cross-country team. And sometimes our cross-country competitions against other high schools would be held in a place called Forest Hill Park, which is in suburban Cleveland Heights and suburban East Cleveland. And we would run on the hills and on the trails in those wooded areas, part of our 2-mile cross-country competition. What I'm telling you is that trails and parks and green spaces, I had access to them. And I think there was the equity, at least it was for me, to get to those green spaces. So that's a little bit of my background regarding what we're going to be talking about today. Let me introduce our panels for the summit today. We are going to be visited with Ryan Chao, who's president of Rails to Trails Conservancy. He oversees the organization as National Leadership in Trail Development, Policy, Public Policy, and Movement of Buildings. Before Trails to Rails, Ryan was with the Annie E. Casey Foundation, where he led significant neighborhood transformation initiatives across the country. Also with us is Cash. He's superintendent of the Great Smoky Mountain National Park of the National Park Service. He's been superintendent for Boston National Historic Park before and Boston African American National Historic Society, and has worked with the city of Boston to open a new visitor center in the historic Faneuil Hall. Also with us is Catherine Girves. She's a senior planner at Toole Design Group and a nationally recognized expert in active transportation. She's received regional and additional and national awards for her work designing and delivering mode shift programming. Rachel Fryerson is part of our panel, Director of Programming for Detroit RiverFront Conservancy. She oversees and implements the diverse programs which activate the Detroit RiverFront and Dequindre Cut to create a world-class gathering space, which draws up to 3 million people a year. And Nicole Jackson is on our panel as well, an environmental educator, park advocate, a birder, and an organizer. She is a native of Cleveland. She's in Columbus right now, but some of her early work involved connecting underrepresented communities and youth to resources and opportunities that provide them with equitable access to green spaces. So why don't we begin right now for the next 55 minutes or so? Let's bring in Cassius. Cassius, you're superintendent of Great Smoky Mountain National Park. Let me ask you, how are things going at Great Smoky Mountain National Park now that the pandemic seems to be easing?
Right. Well, good morning from the Smokiest here in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. And Leon, I enjoyed your opening there, and you're talking about being a Boy Scout, which is what turned me on to becoming familiar with the natural world and eventually becoming a wildlife biologist. And also, I could have sworn that you were about to say Cassius Clay when you introduced me this morning, which you wouldn't have been the first to do that. So again, it's an honor to be here with everyone this morning to talk about trails and getting people involved with it. So in regards to the Smokies, right now, people, as you stated, the restrictions are starting to be relaxed, and we definitely see that here in the park. We've experienced record numbers already of visitation. For example, in the month of March, we normally average around 300,000 to 400,000 people for that month. This year, our March numbers, we're looking at 900,000 people in 1 month, and that's in March. And we normally don't see those numbers into spring break or around May sometimes. So if that's an indicator of what's to come for the remainder of the year, it's no doubt that we're going to breach 13 million visitors this year, and understandably so, because national park system is the antithesis of what COVID was really about. COVID was about droplets and masks and 6 feet. Here, in the parks, you have clean air, clean water, freedom. And so people were direly yearning that, and they look at their national parks as refuges to experience that. So that's how we're doing here in the Smokies.
Okay, well, I'm glad to hear that. Tell everybody down in Gatlinburg and in the Great Smokies that we said hello, and we're on our way. We're going to get there. We're going to get there this summer. Certainly, that's the plan. Ryan Chao, you're with the president of Rails to Trails Conservancy. Ryan, we talk about making trails and outdoor areas more inclusive. That's what we're talking about today. Talk a little bit about that. How do we make them more inclusive? What do we mean when we say we want to make them more inclusive?
Yeah, well, thank you, Leon. And maybe first to build off of what Cassius mentioned, the pandemic was harrowing and challenging in so many ways, but it was extraordinary when it comes to the understanding and awareness of parks and of trails and their value. And when the pandemic first hit, we saw nationally a 200% increase in trail usage. That tapered a bit, but it has remained about 50% more across the country, even now as people have more options. So I think the great thing is that people are understanding that outdoor activity is not just a nice thing to do, that trails and parks aren't just nice amenities, they're essential for personal wellness, for community wellness. And I think when you talk about inclusivity, one thing that is encouraging is that over the pandemic, we saw many people turn to the outdoors for the first time, or to do it in a way that they hadn't as consistently. Those folks tend to be more diverse in terms of race and of gender and age. That was great, but we've done some national surveying and assessment, and we find that while people of all races and backgrounds turn to the outdoors for the same reasons, for exercise, for respite, for connection, people of color are less likely to do so. And we did get some survey information that African Americans were less likely to seek outdoor recreation and activity during the pandemic. There are lots of reasons for that, feelings of safety, feelings of being welcomed, proximity and access. But I think as we understand the outdoors is just so essential for everyone, it's incumbent upon us that we make that opportunity as inclusive and open as possible.
Yeah. Nicole Jackson, let's bring you into the conversation. And let me tell you, all of our panelists, feel free to jump in. Feel free to jump in if you want to dovetail into what somebody is saying at that point. Feel free to jump in. It will help us, and it certainly will help me. I don't have to work quite as hard because we're going to have you giving your expertise. But Nicole Jackson, I know you have worked with connecting underrepresented communities and youth to resources and opportunities to provide them with equitable access to green space. Speak to this issue a little bit, won't you, Nicole Jackson?
Yeah, so growing up in inner city Cleveland, I've being raised with a big family. I have 10 siblings, 7 sisters and 3 brothers. So my access to parks growing up in Cleveland, a lot of it was city parks. So after school, we would visit our neighborhood parks just because my mom wanted us out the house. And, you know, having such a big family really helped with us just keeping tabs on each other, but also knowing that getting outside was a way for us to express ourselves and enjoy our time and really give my mom a break from having to raise so many kids. But at the same time, as I got older, I realized there wasn't a lot of opportunities to connect to more green space. There's a lot of concrete, there's a lot of asphalt, not too much green that I saw growing up, but then moving on to college, I realized, you know, there was even more places that I could go to and just be out and present in. And a lot of my connection to nature growing up was actually, unfortunately, from my experiences in foster care earlier on. When I was young and using nature as a healing mechanism. I was unfortunately abused while I was in foster care. So for me, it was a healing mechanism. But then as I got older, I wanted to use that more as an educational tool to help other kids that look like me heal and use nature to not only feel safe, but to thrive when they're going through struggles of their own.
You're also a birder, I understand. That
Yes.
helps you too. That helps in that healing process that you were looking for and may still be looking for.
Yes, I was always interested in nature and just being out. I was the one in my family who's just really loves being outside on a different level and just learning about plants and animals and things of that nature, but then also connecting to specifics. So I didn't really learn about bird watching until college through an internship I did at The Ohio State University. And through that time, I'd actually visited Cuyahoga Valley National Park a few times, but I'd never bird watched there. So I was only just hiking. And then it became even more awesome when I got to explore the different bird watching spots with the birding community.
We'll all be cicada watching probably for the next couple of weeks or
Yes.
so. Catherine Girves, give me your thoughts on what we're talking about now. You're senior planner at Toole Design Group, nationally recognized expert in transportation. Give me your thoughts on what we should be doing to fix these problems.
Well, I think Nicole touched on some really important points, and one of them is about safety. We have to think about safety in a variety of ways and access. When I think about safety as it relates to trails, I think about, you know, who is safe and who feels safe in space. I look at Ryan's great background and it's beautiful. But I have found when I take a small group of men on a trail like that, they notice how beautiful it is. When I take a small group of women on a trail like that, they notice how close the trees are to the trail and bring up a variety of things that relate to if I was here alone, how safe would I feel? And understanding the role that rape culture plays for women. I think when talking about safety, we have to talk about who feels threatened by racism, whether that is from other park participants. You know, we've seen examples of that on video in the last year, where people have been threatened, and frankly, from law enforcement. We've had, you know, in Cleveland, a child lost his life playing in the park, and so those are things that we don't often think about when we're thinking about safety, but that's part of this conversation about how people feel in space. And we're not going to know how to design good spaces until we have the expertise of an inclusive group of people at the table. It's a mistake when we're planning to have only male voices at the table or only white voices at the table. We can't plan well for an inclusive community if we're not thinking about that. I also think a lot about access. In my home community, we recently did we looked at the walk shed and the bike shed around our greenway trail system. And when we looked at who has access to the trail system and who doesn't, it overlaps almost exactly with redlining maps. And so, you know, those are other structures that we need to think about when we're thinking about how easy is it to get to this space, particularly if you don't own a car. That becomes a real socioeconomic issue for adults, and frankly, for people who aren't ever going to drive, either because of some physical or or cognitive for reasons, and for our youngest members of our population and our older members of our population who may not be driving. All of those things need to be thought about. And if we continue to do business in the way that we have historically done business, we're not going to solve those problems.
Rachel Fryerson, like to get your comments on this. You're coming to us from Detroit right now, I think. Give us your thoughts on that, and what we need to do, and what would be your approach to it. You work with an organization that draws 3 million people a year. How do we handle all of that?
Yeah, I mean, Detroit is a predominantly Black city. The city is about 80% Black, and so with that, you know, our visitation is the representative of our city, and that was really important to us. So, the Riverwalk, you know, it's also in downtown Detroit, but it's also connects 5 different zip codes. About, I want to say 1/6 of the population is within 2 miles of the riverfront. And like a lot of, you know, Rust Belt and industrial cities, our riverfronts were closed off to the public for a very long time. So our project started in 2003. We opened up our first park in 2007, and now we have about 5.5 miles of greenways and trails and riverfront here in Detroit. And it's really important for our community during COVID. Detroit was also hit really hard with the pandemic, that we became a space for people to just be and heal and breathe. And so what we've been having these conversations with our visitors is like, for the longest time, we spent a lot of time, you know, activating, and that's my role, right? You know, I want to bring people down. I want you to have that first experience. But my next step is, how do you just come down and do on your own? How do you feel on your own? And we have to do that by making spaces comfortable, like Catherine just said, and for making sure that spaces look like them and the team that's around them looks like them as well. And so through the pandemic, we've, just like everyone else, saw massive increase in visitation. We also saw people learn how to be in these parks. And that was our next goal, is just how do we continue to support that?
Tell me what you mean when you say we saw people who were learning how to be. What do you mean by that?
So our society these days, you know, we like to be engaged. We like to be entertained. We like to go see a concert. We like to, you know, do all these things. And so simple things like, you know, grabbing your family and having a picnic in a green space sometimes isn't as natural as one might think. And so we like to give and offer opportunities to be able to do that. So passive placemaking on one of our trails at a Quinder Cut, which connects our farmers market down to the riverfront. We installed some natural playscapes, some low touch amenities, put some picnic tables in spaces that they normally wouldn't have been. just to showcase, hey, like this is a spot that you can feel welcome. You can jump around, play around, and just kind of change your traditional thought of just, I need to walk on this trail from point A to B, but you can experience the paths along that trail, if that makes sense.
Does anybody else want to add anything to that as we continue this conversation? Catherine,
Yeah.
go ahead, Cassius.
Yeah, so I just want to piggyback off that because that's absolutely right. It reminds me of an example when the Park Service was celebrating their 100-year anniversary centennial in 2016, and I made a commitment to hike. We have 800 miles of trails in this park here, and I committed to hiking 100 miles of that over a year's time. But every mile was done with a kid from urban area that had never been to the national park. And I understand the platform that I have as the first African-American in this position. So I felt an obligation to facilitate that relationship between kids that, because when you're looking from Knoxville, the Smokiest looks very intimidating. I mean, you just don't know where to begin with that. And so what I found over that year, Leon, was a transformation, not only in these young folks, but in myself, of just being able to see that in real time. And I want to make it not be, and I told my rangers, we're not going to be identifying trees and birds and butterflies. This is not a field trip. I just wanted them to be, as Rachel just said, to be, and just to internalize that experience and experience something that most kids don't do today, which is slow down, to be able to have the time to reflect on that. And so I hope through that process, and this is one of the quotes my friends talk about, when we have our free time, if we go to the movies, if we go wherever, we know how to calculate the return of investment of what we do with that free time. A lot of our kids don't know how to make that calculation on that return of investment if I decide to go outdoors. And so through this experience, hopefully we've been able to say, I want to remember that experience, because I remember, as one kid said, I felt free. I didn't know this park was mine. And so now the next time that young person has an opportunity, he or she hopefully will remember that the return of an investment they experienced through hiking with me.
Yeah, thank you. Nicole, I know you wanted to say something too, Nicole.
Yeah, there's try to condense everything from what Catherine was saying earlier, but yeah, I'm one of those who doesn't have a vehicle. I don't own a car, so I use public transportation and have since forever. So for me, it's in thinking about the intersections with a lot of these conversations is, transportation, access, but then also helping others feel comfortable in these spaces. I've had so many moments where I'm very much into nature. So for me, it's just like, okay, let's go to a park, explore, discover, whatever. But then family and friends, they're a little bit more hesitant. Even if they are with me, there's still that hesitancy of, where are we going? How far away is it? Are there other people that are going to be there that I know? Am I going to have to prepare myself, with a weapon, or, those kinds of questions have come up. And regarding bird watching, last year, a group of us created Black Birders Week in response to the Christian Cooper incident that happened with a Black bird watcher and a white woman, Amy Cooper and Christian Cooper, to really hone in on the barriers and the issues around racism when it comes to Black people being outdoors and what we experience on a regular basis, whether it be through working out in the field or just doing very basic outdoor activities, and really having an honest conversation of how we feel and how that continues to be a problem for us, but moving towards creating safer environments and having honest conversations of how we can create more solutions.
Catherine Girves, I see you nodding in the amen corner over there. Nodding.
Well, yes, and I, what Rachel said about like who we hire, like those things matter to whether people see themselves in space, whether people know they'll be backed by a person in authority if something odd happens in space. I think too about a trail I was walking recently, and the markers on the trail and what was identified and who was celebrated and the stories that were told. And it was a very white story about settlers. That is not the history of the space that I live in. Like this in thinking about all those sorts of details sends very clear cues about who belongs in this space. I think each person has touched on, like, do you feel like this space is for you or don't you? And what are the overt and covert ways in which we message that? And I think we really have to look at everything we're doing, from the markers we put up and who the stories we're telling in those markers, and who's deciding how the space is designed, and who the people in authority are when you get to a space. What's likely to happen if there's a conflict between trail users. Like, all of these are very real things that we need to talk about. And like Nicole said, talk about with honesty.
Yeah. By the way, I'll tell our audience that Liz Thorstenson is taking your questions, and we'll try to squeeze in some questions as we get toward the end of this panel discussion. So I'm telling our audience, feel free to put them in the chat, or however Liz said do that. Somebody a little bit ago talked about public transportation. People need access. Not everybody has an automobile. Nicole does not drive, so not everybody has an automobile to get to a park area. How do we fit transportation into this? And who wants to take on that question and give us an answer? Then I will find somebody.
I think that's a huge. Oh, go ahead, Ryan.
Let me start and then please build on it. And this is fun, just riffing off each other. Leon, maybe before talking about public transportation, I think a few things you said, and Rachel as well, are really important, and they relate to this, which is the importance of close to home outdoor access. And I think the pandemic showed us how important it is to be able to have convenient, accessible access to the outdoors. And for people to really feel like they're part of this, to feel like it's really something they belong to, it needs to be close by. So I think it's important to think of trails as not something that runs through communities, but they are things that are part of communities. And what's happening in Detroit is terrific. There's a great example in California, Bay Area, the Richmond Greenway, which is really as much just the center of a neighborhood and of assets as much as something that is then a linear component. But I think when it comes to public transportation, I mean, a few thoughts. One is that trails provide an opportunity themselves for transportation. And when they are connected, and I think this is an important piece, is to think about as we plan trails and doing it in an inclusive way, that they're not just each their own little piece, that they connect to a broader active transportation system. That creates a whole opportunity for mode shift, just using walking and biking as an alternate form of transportation. But I think it is important that we continue to be strong partners with public transit around trails being the last mile of connection to public transit. Certainly there are challenges in this evolving world, but I think one thing that's kind of interesting is that while train usage is down, we hope it comes back up, usage of buses has actually increased in many places. And I think the idea of being more creative about connecting to public transit systems, not just transit hubs, but all the places public transit goes, is a really important thing to be more innovative about.
Who pays for this? How do we get these places built? I know, Cassius, you've got the federal government, and that's all of us. We're all part of the government. We're paying for this. But what about some of the other areas? Who pays to increase these trails or make these trails? And where do we add trails and green spaces and parks? Anybody, feel free.
Well,
Rachel?
I'll start. Yeah, I'll start. The Detroit RiverFront Conservancy, we're a nonprofit organization. We've been a public-private partnership since we started, and so which has been able to take some of the onus off the city in ways that we can kind of manage spaces and move a little bit quicker on some things. And I think what Ryan said is really important. We started with a vision of 5.5 miles of riverfront. We've got about 3 miles of riverfront done, but we've added 1.5 miles of greenway here. We're adding another 2 miles there. So now we're pushing ourselves into the neighborhoods. So we have direct access down into these spaces based on transit. And so, that conversation is a mix of both tax dollars, individuals. We did a lot of conversations, on just small contributions this year. We had actually some of our greatest, donor solicitations this year with small contributions, just really talking to our friends and neighbors who came to the riverfront during this time.
Well, while I've got you there, let me ask you, Rachel. Are there ever people who say, I don't want you to build in that neighborhood. I don't want you to build not in my, everybody sees the need for a fire station. I once covered a story in one of the suburbs of Cleveland where the people were against the fire station being built in the neighborhood. But when there was a fire in the neighborhood, everybody said, oh my God, we got to have a fire station here. Well, eventually they did build a fire station. Not in my neighborhood, they were saying. Are there people who are saying, not in my neighborhood do I want you to build a trail or a park or a green space? Do you run into that?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the big things that when we started was we had over 100 community meetings. We were bringing models, physical models, to different neighborhoods all across the city, saying this is going to be yours. This is going to be, we are a world-class gathering space for all. Bring everybody is our slogan. And so really it was just kind of convincing that we could create those promises that world-class, beautiful, safe, accessible. And so we are actually in the process of building a brand new park, 22-acre park. And with that park, we took 20 Detroiters to 3 different cities to show them the best of those parks, and then brought them home and said, what would you like to see here? What would you like to do here? That also came with some controversy. You're spending all this money on this park. I need this for my school. And we're really trying to work with people to say, how can also this park become a classroom? How can we use our spaces in different ways? And so when we have those conversations, we're definitely all ears. We have a new greenway, but that greenway is really specifically for residents to get in and out of that space. We're not going to advertise it in the same way we might a different one, which is kind of isolated on its own. And so that's kind of how we approach those conversations.
I think when we talk about who's going to pay for things in dollars, we really need to have conversations about what we currently pay for. What does it actually cost to add a freeway ramp versus building? You could build out an entire trail network with a single freeway ramp. And so reframing these conversations about what we're valuing and frankly, who we're valuing. When we build car infrastructure, we are specifically valuing a class of people, a group of people who have the ability to own, operate, and maintain a car. And that's fine, but we need to be clear that that's what we're doing, and not everyone has that. And furthermore, that the largest asset we own as a community is our public right-of-way, is our public parks. And so how are we investing in who gets to access those places? If we're not building access from neighborhoods, and the only way you can access our parks is by a car, we've decided who doesn't belong. And so that has to be part of the conversation. If we have a trail network that's only open from dawn to dusk, we've said this isn't part of the transportation system. And if I'm working second shift and using the towpath to get home, I probably won't get stopped. But will Nicole get stopped if she uses it to get home from a second shift job? So we have to have conversations about that. Who has access? Who have we designed these places to have access for? And what are we going to do about that?
Cassius, you're there at the Great Smoky Mountains. Is there anything that the locals can learn from the nationals? Because you've got that big plot of land there that you're superintendent of. Is there anything that we can learn from what you are doing, or that you have learned as a result of your being superintendent?
Yeah, so most of it's been said already, and I just think to allow or create an environment where people see themselves in that environment. So, for example, here, we give interpretive programs about the Native Americans that were here, before it became a national park, the European settlers in Appalachia, but there are also African-American grave sites here, right? And we haven't done history on those things there. And so, what would it be to have a hiking trail that visits these African-American grave sites and learn about those things on the way? That will, if nothing else, spark the curiosity for people to want to learn more about that. And so again, I just want to double back on that, allow people to see themselves in these spaces is the way to go. And I think, when we talk about hiking and being in natural worlds, we need to talk about it too. It's not only good for physical well-being, but after coming through COVID, we need to talk more about the emotional and mental well-being. And so it's a total package, and people relate to that. And if this is the antidote, which is free, I think people have a different an affinity to getting out there. And just one quick example I want to use for that is, my dad is a retired police officer in Memphis. And when George Floyd incident happened, it took me to a bad space, being African-American, being the son of a police officer. And I had decided that, marching is not my niche. So what could I do with this piece of property here, we call the Smokiest, to contribute toward that? So I came up with what we call the Smokiest Hikes for Healing initiative, which consisted of 8 hikes. 10 people could apply to be on these hikes. And I had a highly trained facilitators to talk about the value of diversity and social justice, and what powerful place that became as a place of consciousness to be in the most biodiverse ecosystem in the country, in the national park system, and to look at those strengths and to try to apply that to the human ecosystem. So, how we apply the natural world to what we're going through today, I think we need to develop better chops about how we talk about it more than just a physical aspect.
Nicole is giving you a nod of approval. I'm
Good.
looking at the screen right now. Nicole, you want to add anything to that while we're on this subject?
Yes. And I'm glad you brought up the healing hikes. So I remember watching the video with David Lamfrom and Tyler Gonzalez, good friends of mine. I actually met David some years ago in regards to a leadership program I was doing around bird conservation. So it's good to see him again. And last year after Black Birders Week, I actually, so I'm a part of the National Parks Conservation Association's Next Gen Advisory Council, so since 2018. And when Black Birders Week was over, I wanted to do something more in regards to increasing diversity in national parks, and specifically focused on African-American diversity. And this happened in August. So essentially I created Black and National Parks Week during the week of the birthday, I think it's the 104th birthday of the National Park Service, to have these conversations. And I don't think, I think it was after that I heard more about Cash's program, Healing Hike program, but it really gave me an opportunity to share things that I was learning, that I was educating myself about my own history and how I can feel more connected to these parks, knowing that there's 423 park units, not just the main ones that we hear about on a regular basis, but the ones that aren't so popular, but still have that history, still have those untold stories. And you were referencing that, Cassius, with cemeteries. And there's a lot of Black people that I know that have recently taken visits to Black people that have taken visits to national parks, and they are just blown away with that alone, just the history of African Americans and their contributions, and had never known any of that, but then also connecting it to the emotional and mental health of, because of the George Floyd incidents and even the ones before that, have given them space and time to heal and grieve, which I very much is why I'm so connected to nature, because I know and have witnessed the healing benefits that we all need, but specifically Black people and going through these conversations.
Yeah. There's a man by the name of William Stinchcomb, who was executive director of the Cleveland Metro Parks from 1921 to 1957. He's kind of like called the father of the Cleveland Metro Park system. One of the things he wrote is, by nature, man is out of doors animal. City life with its noise, its hustle and confusion give little opportunity for the rest and repose essential to well-being. And he says that parks will give us that rest and repose. I'm thinking about in the city of Cleveland right now, and other cities that I've been in, there are large swaths of area, large areas where there is nothing. There used to be homes, there used to be houses, there used to be thriving businesses, but now it's just kind of wide open spaces. Can we build trails and parks and green spaces in some of these areas? But not that are just kind of lying, what's the word, fallow right now? Ryan, what do you think?
Absolutely. And I think one thing that, whether it's areas that are suffering from abandonment or simply just underinvested communities, we have all across this country trail deserts, places where there are either people who could benefit from them or communities that just need to be reimagined. And having this kind of close to home access, equitable access to trails, walking and biking is a wonderful way, not just to serve people, but really be a catalyst for reinvesting in communities and thriving broader areas as well. One thing that we're starting to work on is we do a lot of GIS mapping. We have TrailLink, which is kind of the most popular app on the web for people to find trails, but we're going to try to take that to a national level and develop what we're calling a national equity map, which allows any community to see where trails are located and then juxtapose those against all kinds of different dynamics, whether it's kind of income in neighborhoods, development in neighborhoods, and really take a holistic look at how do you really answer this trail desert issue and be as equitable in how they're distributed.
Anybody else want to? Well, let me ask you: how do we pay for this? Where does the money come from?
Yeah.
To take, I mean, we're dreaming big here on the panel, but who's going to pay for this?
Now, Leon, let me just finish that because I'm glad you asked it before. And if you've seen any of the RTC folks on these webinars over the course of the summit this week, many of us are kind of bleary in our eyes and look a little tired. And part of that is it's been a momentous last couple of weeks when it comes to this question of how do you increase investment in trails, walking, and biking. I won't get too wonky here, but what is very exciting in terms of how trails and active transportation infrastructure are funded, there are several main federal programs: the Transportation Alternatives Program, the Recreational Trails Program, state, local government also play a role. But both chambers of Congress are advancing legislation that would close to double the federal programs for trails. So the question of how to pay for it, there's in fact real momentum to increase many of the core programs. And I think what's maybe most exciting is there's a new bill called the Connecting America's Active Transportation System Act, quite a mouthful. That will be the first time that competitive grants are available at the federal level, specifically for connected trail systems. So this is a brand new program, hundreds of millions of dollars a year we expect to do exactly this, allow communities not just to incrementally build trails, but really take that next step to create cohesive, equitable systems. We're not there yet, but it's an exciting time, and we hope to have this victory by September.
Catherine, you have a thought of that? Do you have a thought on that?
I guess I just go back to your fire station. Like, people understand the value of fire stations, and the role of government is actually to do the thing that is going to collectively benefit all of us. And what we know from polling data is people are hungry for trails. People want access to trails, and communities that invest in these types of systems are communities that do well. We have to stop pretending like we don't have the money to do these things and reframe the conversation in how are we currently spending, in particular, our transportation dollars, and who's benefiting from those, and how do we make sure that we're creating systems that are equitable, and that we're investing in everyone's ability to move from one place to another.
We have to do a public relations job, don't we, Rachel, on selling this? Rachel and or Ryan and Cassius and Nicole and Catherine, we have to do a public relations job, not only with the people in the community, but also with the federal government and the state government and the county government and I guess city government as well.
So Leon,
go ahead.
So one of the things that, you talked about how we pay for it, and I just want to make sure our listeners know that there are federal opportunities. If you're familiar with the Land and Water Conservation Fund, there is a particular section of that fund, and we're talking about billions of dollars, where local and city governments can tap into to get grants to create these recreational areas, particularly in cities. And that's a long-standing program that I think that we need to have cities and city governments and states look into. So it's called the Land Water Conservation Fund. I'm not adept at it, but I do know that there have been many lands that you described that have been put into this program to create green spaces for exactly what we're talking about here this morning.
Rachel, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think it's actually a pretty interesting question. When we start, the state of Michigan just $250 million is going to our state park system. They just announced that yesterday with American Rescue Plan, which is wonderful and great. We actually have 2 state parks in the city of Detroit. And we have to make that connection to Detroiters that these parks will also get that support. Sometimes I think in urban communities, city communities, because we aren't as close to national parks or state parks or even metro parks, we're saying this money is getting diverted into a suburban environment. And that brings up that conversation about transportation. Okay, so if we're making these investments in these parks, how are we going to get our predominantly our centers of population to those spaces? So say they see the value and they realize it's just not for someone who might live in a rural community. So I think we have to do a better job of explaining that this is for them as well. And that's just starts very much. I started this conversation with B. With the thought of how much that space means to them and their backyard community and how that continues to expand. So.
Okay, we're going to continue this conversation, but I know Liz Thorstenson is with us. And Liz, can we bring you in? Are you getting any questions from
Yes,
audience?
I do have a question from Susan. She lives in a mid-sized city in which they're often faced with gaps in knowledge or exposure to micromobility and urban planning, but particularly within minority communities. Have any of the presenters had experience building capacity or creating pipelines within minority communities to grow local leaders who could bring more diversity to these fields, which tend to be very white male dominated? Any examples would be welcome. Thank you.
Panelists, take it. Anybody want to take that?
I had sent a message, but the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy has a great youth leadership program. But I'd also recognize the groups that are doing that work in your community that might be completely separate from your parks department. So we find ourselves to be a host, right? If there's a great teen program happening, how can we host a picnic for you? How can we, get you out here in a different way that you would be interested in? Are you interested in sensor projects and robots? Like, how can we do that here on the riverfront and become that host for them and build that relationship that way? It's also one of those things that something that makes sense in a different city, like our bike share program in Detroit is really popular, but it's really popular around people who just want to tour for 2 hours versus using it from point A to point B. So understanding really what your community needs and realizing it might not be the exact same thing that you might see in a different city.
We've got about 8 minutes remaining on our time. Liz, is there another question that you have from one of our viewers?
Yes, I have one more for you. When there's old issues of folks wanting to keep things segregated, so for example, people saying, don't bring that trail here, it will bring, quote unquote, those folks here. So I think that's really about connectivity, right? And we're trying to create really thoughtfully integrated, connected trail systems. But when there's opposition to connect one trail to another community, it'd be great for folks to talk about how do we address that from as advocates or community organizers or planners.
I think part of it is by naming it, right? Like we have to talk honestly about what the underlying root of that is, and turn to our community leaders to say, do you support that, or is that underlying root of not in my backyard, not those people, because that's often what we hear, going to be something that is not a community value and that's not going to influence.
Catherine, do you find that if somebody says that once the trail is built, they have a change of heart, a change of mind?
Oftentimes, yes. People worry about things that are often rooted in prejudice around socioeconomics and race, that access means crime, which is an old trope that is inaccurate. And when people, what actually ends up happening is property values increase, like all sorts of good things happen for communities. But we can't be confused as community leaders and as professionals that is a legitimate argument. We need to have real conversations about what that's based on, and what our values are as a community, living up to our values of valuing people.
Did somebody else want to jump in on this?
I just quickly, I would add that I think part of this is also listening to those concerns, whether they, trying to understand the root cause in certain ways. I think it's bringing people together and also bringing community members and representatives who are not necessarily part of the biking and trails world. It's important to get a whole mix of perspectives. But I think Rachel mentioned that some of their work was to see examples in other places. And I do think seeing on the ground what trails mean for communities is often the most powerful. I have a saying I like to say, which is trails build trust. And when you see trails actually in action connecting communities, often those issues around stigma or presupposition go away because you actually understand all that it could mean for everyone in the community.
Okay, we are down to about our last 5 minutes or so, and why don't we do a round robin here and give everybody a 45 seconds or a minute or so to give us a final thought. And Nicole, you're over there. I'm looking at you right now there on my computer here. Give us a final thought as we round third and begin heading home.
Yeah, so this pandemic has thrust a lot of us into a lot to still process and deal with. And for me, it's given me time to pause, even though I've been doing that already, but like in a different kind of introspective way that's more helpful to others in taking my knowledge and understanding of how I connect to nature to heal, but also using that to share with others to show them that they can do the same thing. And a lot of that has happened with the pandemic, of stepping outside of having to step outside or being forced to step outside of your comfort zone to see a different vision for yourself, for your community, which I think is very important. So I spent most of this time just educating myself on the things that I thought I knew, that I needed to learn more about, and just digging deeper into how I can be more helpful and useful and having more of these honest conversations, but knowing that it takes a community, it takes a village to be a part of that as a solution as well. So there's so many people out there having these conversations, but really going back to what Ryan was saying, just the listening needs to happen more, and not being reacting to everything, but really taking the time to listen and process and then move forward.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Rachel, you're up next.
I think it's just really important to meet your community where they are, have those conversations and discussions with them, versus, kind of, putting your thoughts there. I think that creates honest and genuine conversations. The other thing, I'm in a cold Midwest city, and maybe some of you guys are as well. Take advantage of your winter. We hadn't in a long time in the riverfront. It's cold, it's windy, it's lonely, it's all the things. And this year we became a safe space for people to be outside. So big fires, music, things that we love in Detroit. We just did it, and we did it outside, and make people enjoy that. And so take advantage of the things that your town is known for, and just make them bigger and better. And yeah, thank you guys.
Okay, many thanks. There is always music in Motown, music in many, many ways. Catherine Girves, what do you think?
I guess my final thought is for professionals. We have to reframe the way we're thinking about this, which is often, why aren't people coming to utilize these facilities? To what structures and barriers have we created so that people can't access the facilities we're designing and creating?
Makes sense to me. How about you, Ryan? Ryan Chao.
Yeah, it was great to hear the different views on what outdoor activity has meant for folks physically and mentally. And I think what's really interesting is there's more research coming out about how important that is in terms of just whole body health. And even this idea that a couple hours in nature is the new 10,000 steps a day. It can be that meaningful for wellness and healing. So I think it just puts the responsibility on all of us that we're in this amazing moment where we've had a simultaneous change in attitudes and behaviors around trail use and outdoor activity. Usually attitudes change, behaviors have to follow later. They've happened simultaneously. So I think, Leon, to your question of do we need a PR campaign, to some degree, the pandemic has changed our attitudes and behaviors. But I think in order for that to really be meaningful and take this moment and make the most of it, it has to be benefit everyone equally and in an inclusive, collaborative way.
Okay, I agree with that. I think we all agree with that. Cassius Cash, you're the anchor man. You're running the anchor leg.
All right. Well, I just, I've really enjoyed this conversation today. And as I look across this screen and, the diversity of not only our faces and how we look, but our perspectives on what we bring to this, it's going to take all of that and more to get at the outcome that we've been talking about here this hour. And one of the things that I share with people of why I work for the National Park Service, I share with them there are very few organizations that evolves with America's consciousness, whether it's through talking about slavery, whether it's through talking about being outdoors in the natural world. And so the Park Service is in the forever business. And that's what we're talking about as far as getting the next generation of users, supporters, and advocates to be active in being outdoors. And this is something like any other relationship, whether it's with your significant other, your spouse, or whatever. This is not an overnight instance. This is a relationship that we have to continually build upon to get the objective that we've all reached on that. And so we've talked about barriers of why people can't sometimes get to natural spaces, but also say we should talk about our mental starting points. Because when we talk to people about getting out, it's about, particularly in the park, the first question is, what's going to bite me? What's going to eat me? What's bad going to happen for me? We have to address that as well, because there are people with cars and resources and all the means to get to that. But their mental point of starting, how they embrace the natural world, is just as much a barrier as transportation, right? So I think we have a lot of work to do. It's going to take all of us on this call, this video call today, to make it happen. So thank you for inviting me to this. It's been an honor.
The honor is ours to have you with us. Tell everybody down in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, in the Great Smoky Mountains, we're on our way.